Good day, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to this session of the conference. And this is perhaps one of the most common recurring topics in the provision and upgrading of waste management services in South Africa. This discussion hopes to give some light on how we can address both the financing of waste management, whilst also working on improving practices in waste management, working toward the circular economy. And with that, I'm glad to introduce Sally Ann, who's the Director of Circular Vision. And she's done a lot of work within the waste and circular economies, and their focus is driving economic, social, and environmental prosperity through connecting the value chain. And Sally Ann, without much further ado, I'll hand over to you to introduce the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Tawanda, and it's my absolute pleasure to be with such an amazing panel this morning. I'm looking forward to it, and I'm looking forward to hearing all about Regeneres and the Vola and all the new work that Linda's been part of over the last few years and at the moment as well. So I think what we'd like to do first is just to introduce the panel, and then we'll get into some of the questions and answers. But before we actually do that, maybe just to set the scene a little bit in terms of just where we're at in South Africa with waste management. And according to Stats South Africa, waste management is not doing too badly when we look at the numbers. 66% of households have access to waste management. But what about the rest, right? So how do we fill this gap in terms of the collection rates for household waste collection? And apparently in 2019, it's actually been it's at the lowest it's ever been in more than a decade. So is this, a market failure at the heart of South African waste economy? How can this be corrected to facilitate the implementation of the waste hierarchy? And how can we look at innovative business models to drive change? All the while addressing the most basic waste management service provision, especially in poorly serviced areas. So in the city of Cape Town, where we're going to be focusing today, essentially they report 89% access to waste management within the city. And with 80% of the cost covered from rates and tariffs, and 20% from transfers in terms of equitable share of taxes and grants from national and provincial government. But essentially, there's still a gap of service provision and how we actually, get suitable waste management services to all. And what does this mean? And how do we transition to something that is actually more valuable across the board in terms of this basic requirement that we have, especially working in urban environments. So before we get into that, let's just have an introduction of the panel that we're going to speak to today. I'd like to start with Chad, only because you're first on my screen. So Chad, maybe just a quick introduction of who you are, and maybe a quick overview initially of what Regeneres is. And then we'll move on to the other panelists to introduce themselves and do the same. Thanks.
Thanks, Sally Ann. Good morning, everybody. My name is Chad Robertson. I am the co-founder of Regeneres. Regeneres essentially is a residential recycling solution on a mission to make recycling more accessible, inclusive, and rewarding. So we provide residents with a freemium recycling service, where we also integrate informal waste collectors into our collection model. And then lastly, we incentivize residents with our virtual currency called Rumani. Thank you.
That's great. And we're definitely going to unpack that in a few moments. Linda, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Morning. Thanks, Sally Ann, and morning to the rest of the panelists. My name is Linda Godfrey, and I'm a researcher at the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research in South Africa, and also a professor at Northwest University. And I think my particular interest is really, how do we evidence this whole discussion around waste management? I think, more and more we're dealing with complexities, we're dealing with system issues, we're dealing with system failures. And if we're not coming with the evidence to really inform the decisions, we're trying to fight this battle with one arm behind our back. So it's really the importance of research and evidence-based policy, evidence-based decision making. So I have a particular interest around waste and the circular economy within a developing country context in light of that. So I'm looking forward to the discussions. Thanks, Sally-Ann.
Thanks, Linda. Important points raised right there and then. Thanks for that. Tawanda, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself as well, please. I know you're not necessarily part of this panel, but you are. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Tawanda, I think. My background is chemical engineering. I started a GreenCape in the waste economy team, looking at systems and process design. So there's a lot around designing integrated waste management systems in municipalities. And the idea around the projects I've worked in is how can you assist municipalities look at the full system holistically, not look at bits and chunks. Thanks, Hallie.
Thanks, Tawanda. Thanks very much for that. I think it's really important understanding where the good work that GreenCape does, and I'm sure many people do. Liam, over to you, please. Go ahead. Sorry, I was on mute. Liam, over to you. Please go ahead. I think you might be on mute, Liam. Apologies. Let's try again.
Oh, thank you, Sally-Ann.
There we go.
My name is Liam Smith, and I'm the head of research. I am the head of research and operations at Vola. And essentially what Vola is a solution to enhance the impact of any social development model through the introduction of incentives. And the idea behind this is that it encourages participatory, citizenship, like it allows communities to take ownership of solutions that address the problems in their community, and these incentives essentially flow through the community, not only impacting people that are living there, but also flowing into the small business. So not only do we address the social needs of a community through this incentive, we also give the individual access to additional income, and on top of that we also develop the local economy. So that's in a nutshell what Vola does. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Liam. Don't mute yourself just yet. I think I'm going to stay with you for the minute, just so we can kick off our discussion and talk about these different models. So you've given us a snapshot overview of Vola. Can you tell us a little bit about the organization and the actual projects, and how these benefits are actually, how do they come about? How does it actually work?
Oh, okay. Excellent. So currently we are focusing on grassroots solutions. So for example, if you're looking at community safety, we have a project running with the Neighborhood Watch in Umnoto village in Mill District, Gauteng, where we essentially incentivize young members of that community to participate in the Neighborhood Watch and to actually, increase the resilience of safety in that community. And that has been quite effective. So in that example, I can actually sort of explain how Vola would work. The individual would register, to essentially earn Vola from the Neighborhood Watch. They would sign up to participate in patrols, and as they are patrolling in the community and they finish their patrols, they earn Vola. So they don't earn like a small amount, they earn quite a decent amount of Vola. And one Vola is essentially equivalent to like 1 rand. So if you're earning 4 rand, then that individual can then go to a local business, they can essentially just spend that Vola at that small business for any goods or services that they need. So small businesses aren't just your spaza shops. We're also looking at your local mechanics, we're looking at your ECD centers, as well as maybe even salons. So we're essentially trying to drive this incentive and the value of the money being invested in that community right through the beneficiaries into small business development. So yeah, we're also currently doing a waste management project in Kalmore, where we're doing collection and recycling as well as workshops for households to essentially know how to handle their waste. You have organic waste, then you have plastics that can be recycled and plastics that can't. And then we also have a community restoration project in Kamo as well. So it essentially, with funding, allows the community to tackle issues that are relevant to their locality. And we've seen that because the solutions come from the community, communities take full ownership of it. So the solutions are also more resilient at the end of the day. So, yeah.
So essentially, Vola is more of a voluntary organization with funding that is donated to help with the projects. And the projects, for example, like the waste management project that you've undertaken, there's funding that comes in, but essentially the people on the ground are volunteers. Is that right?
Yes, they are actually volunteers. So actually the etymology of the word Vola is actually just volunteer dollar when we came up with it like a couple of years ago. So it's become a bit more than that now. But yeah, it basically just encourages people, especially people, that are, unemployed or not economically active. And you find it a lot, like, in informal settlements where people are dependent on sort of like the informal economy. It actually helps them a lot, this additional revenue, because it affects their households as well. So yeah, that's about it.
Thanks, Liam. I think that's great because I think it sets the scene for one of the models that has come from a grassroots type of level. And now I want to bring Chad into the conversation because his is slightly a little bit different. And Chad, I just want to, essentially your project is, maybe if you can expand on where it's based as well, and just the actual model itself, how it works. What inspired you to start this? Because you started this a couple of years ago. What inspired you to start it? And yeah, tell us a little bit more about Regeneres.
Cool. Thanks for the question. I don't want to keep us here all day, so I'll try and do a summary of that story. But essentially, our mission was from the first moments was clear to get people to recycle. My background is in software as well as my business partner, and so we came from a software background. And we thought, how do we go about changing people's behavior within the waste management field, specifically focused on the recycling rate in South Africa. And we launched with what we have today called Remali, and essentially that was our business at the beginning. And our intention was to partner with recycling companies locally to perform the collections and do the actual waste management. And we'd focus on the the consumer side, focusing on the B2C element and the behavior change element. We couldn't find partners who saw that vision that we had, and that's what caused us to essentially jump into the waste management field and perform the recycling collections ourselves. So in 2017, we launched with a paid recycling model. And obviously we did that so we could bring in the Remali vision that we had of incentivizing people's behavior to see whether it would increase people's activity rates and sign-up rates for recycling. So we started off initially with a paid model, and quickly we became a recycling company, learning from the bottom and doing all the basic things. And then at the end of our first year, we kind of asked ourselves the question, because we were operating in areas where people wanted to recycle. People who had the money to pay for a service, and we kind of had to ask ourselves the question, do we want to become another niche recycling collection service who can only service those who have the means, or do we want to create the impact that we really envisioned we wanted to with our solution? And then we did a pilot of thinking, how do we get our model to work? We also obviously during the first year got to learn about the role of waste pickers in the economy. And so all of that knowledge we got to learn from that first year made us set up this new model, which was a more accessible model, focused on lower to middle income communities, and also obviously working with waste pickers, instead of against them, because it just didn't make sense to us going around having to compete with waste pickers. And then, yeah, that's what really inspired us to start it. And then we did a pilot with it, and that was in 2018, which was quite successful. It was a few months long. We did it in a community that never recycled before. We had a 65% sign-up rate and then a 60% active rate, which isn't the best, but for a community that didn't recycle before, it was doing quite well. And that really obviously gave us a motivation to continue developing the solution. And then, yeah, in 2019, we wanted to grow the model, but it is a model that's obviously very socially focused and requires a bit of upfront capital. And we needed to raise funds, and eventually at the end of 2019, we managed to get a seed fund to launch the service, the free model, while still running this paid model at the same time. And yeah, obviously 2020 wasn't the greatest year to grow things, but we have been progressing slowly, and we still focus on growing that model into more communities. Right now, our focus is primarily in Cape Town. So we are operating in the affluent area, and yeah, we're hard at work trying to get more of our units up and running. I can explain how the whole operation works if that's the next question. I don't want to speak too long, so you can never know.
I think while you've got the floor, do it. Just do it.
Okay.
Just provide us with it.
Cool. So with our free accessible model, essentially what we've done is we've designed the solution obviously to work with the informal waste collectors, as well as in communities that doesn't generally recycle. So firstly, we set up what we call local hubs. So it's a decentralized recycling unit that we put in the communities. And that's where the waste pickers would generally operate from. Each local hub is consisting of 3 waste pickers, 2 that would perform collection and 1 would perform a sorting role. So we set a few of those up in communities, and each one can service up to 600 households a week. Excuse me. And then obviously from the household side, we have a sales team that would go up and sign up the households. Again, in these communities, we have to do a bit more physical sort of sign up. So we go to the communities and we kind of explain to them what's happening, how the service works, why we're doing it, to get their buy-in. And then the residents gets on board, and essentially once we got the waste picker and the resident on board, we obviously connect them. The resident has the clean recyclables and they put it out on a specified date. The waste collectors, which we provide them with recycling tricycles, uniforms and mobile devices, which then connects them to these residents. They then collect on a specific day from the residents. So essentially, we're just trying to connect the whole ecosystem up, because it is very, yeah. And at the end of the day, it's about creating better efficiency in the current collection model, which, as we know, works. But obviously, we're just trying to connect it up from a recycling point of view, and giving them access to clean recyclables and a more dignified way of doing their role.
Thanks, Chad. I think that's a great segue into some of the questions going towards in Linda's direction, because essentially, or to bring Linda into the conversation at this point, because here we're talking about 2 fairly different models. They're very, very socially based and wanting to make impact, social impact, right? And give back to the community and work with the community. Linda, in terms of some of the research that you've done, both in Africa and internationally, I mean, you've done amazing work with Africa, with the Africa Waste Outlook report. So a little bit of what happens elsewhere as well, especially in South Africa too. And in terms of the 2 models that you've heard about this morning, why do you think we're seeing more of these types of models coming into play? I think the answer is pretty obvious, but just from your perspective, in terms of waste management, where we are in South Africa, and are we going to see more and more of these types of models coming to the fore, or where do you see us going?
Thanks, Ellen. Yeah, I think, in my mind, I think there are 2 aspects to it. I think, and look, I am generalizing, and I understand that obviously things in Cape Town and the Western Cape are not necessarily reflective of the whole country. So, I'd like to approach the discussion in terms of what's happening at the country level. And I think, my sense is that we are seeing deteriorating levels of waste service delivery in many of our municipalities. Certainly the Stats SA General Household Survey, the report you referred to earlier, makes the statement that collection is at the lowest level that we've seen in more than a decade. And, I'm continuously alerted, people working in communities that are saying, our municipality is in crisis. There's no waste collection. People are just dumping illegally. So I think the one thing is that there's this desire from communities to want to solve the problems that they're facing. They're wanting to solve issues around illegal dumping, littering, lack of waste collection. But obviously on the flip side of that coin is that there is opportunity in waste. We keep referring to it as waste as resource, waste as secondary resource, and certainly, the models that Liam and Chad have referred to is that there is opportunity for businesses in paper and packaging. I think it's probably the most commonly collected recycling waste stream at the moment. It's got a very large active informal waste sector that's supplying into that value chain. So there is opportunity in that space. I think, you know, one of the potential, you know, I don't want to say necessarily risks, but it always a little bit worries me is that, and I think we're seeing this in other countries in Africa, is that for many countries in Africa, they haven't had formal waste collection systems. They're trying to move into that space. So there's been this void that needs to be filled. And so we see these, you know, social entrepreneurs, these initiatives move into this space. And we've seen incredible innovations emerge on the African continent around filling this space around collection services. There's somewhat of a different situation in Africa, in South Africa, though, where we typically had waste collection services for some. And now we're seeing, you know, perhaps breakdown in some of those services, which is now starting to create a void. And the question is there a risk to the constitutional function of local government if we sort of just allow entrepreneurs to move into the space? There certainly is opportunity and they're rendering a much needed service, but can that continue to erode the performance and the effectiveness of local government? And I think this is something that we need to be very careful about. And so I think it was Liam who mentioned the point around partnerships. I think in my mind, this really can only be solved through close partnerships between all the different stakeholders. How do we get, you know, companies like the ones that Liam and Chad referred to work in partnership with the municipality? To work in partnership with the communities, because I think it's only then that we're truly going to start to solve these problems than to rather perhaps sideline municipalities and to continue. Thanks.
I think that's a really, really great point. And as you were talking, what kept coming up in my head was EPR. So with the extended producer responsibility regulations that are very close to coming into effect, do you think perhaps now is the opportunity to get those partnerships a little bit more formalized in the municipal space, or are you seeing, what are you seeing in your crystal ball?
If only I knew. You know, I think one of the things that keeps me up at night is just practically how we're going to roll EPR out in South Africa. You know, one of the things that always strikes me is that if you look at developed countries, they've followed a typical trajectory of development in the waste sector. They went from, you know, uncontrolled dump sites to controlled dump sites to engineered landfills through strict enforcement, through growing a recycling economy, through to waste to energy, and now into the whole circular economy discussion. And I think the difficulty that developing countries face is that, yes, you know, rightly so, we do want to leapfrog some of those practices, but we're trying to sometimes implement very advanced initiatives on a very shaky foundation. And for me, you know, the basics of, you know, city cleansing and waste collection is the foundation of any waste management system. It's something that you have to have right first before you start putting all the bells and whistles onto the Christmas tree. So, you know, we also have an incredibly large informal sector working in this space. And so our voluntary EPR that we've had in South Africa for, in instances, up to, you know, a decade and more, has been reliant on this large informal waste sector. So that's the one question, is practically how are we going to integrate the informal sector in? I also don't believe that the informal sector alone is going to get the EPR schemes to their mandated targets. So again, we're going, there has to be a role for the formal sector as well in the space, but in a way that doesn't undermine the informal. You know, I know that there's a lot of discussion at the moment, for example, around Johannesburg, and they've just implemented or about to implement a recycling levy. So, you know, what does that mean for the informal sector? I've just written a paper which hopefully should be published soon, where we're starting to see evidence that the informal sector is being eroded by the formal sector, and it may not necessarily be visible to the informal sector because prices have increased. So I think in terms of rands in their pocket, they're not yet, you know, they're not feeling the pinch of that. But when you have shocks in the market like COVID has had in 2020 and 2021, you know, what does that mean for the livelihoods of informal reclaimers? And as we continue to see more erosion by the formal sector, truly, what does it mean for a large section of the population, who is marginalized and has no alternative in terms of formal employment? So I think the real question in my mind, and I think it's something that we need to tackle, is how are we going to practically implement EPR, and what is the relationship also going to be with local government?
I think that's a great question, and I'd like to see, Liam, would you like to take a first stab, just based on your experience and your work that you've done with VALA and probably elsewhere as well? How do you see this rolling out, and how do you see VALA participating or scaling up, using or increasing partnerships? Yeah. Over to you.
So thank you, Sally, and those were incredible points. Thank you, Linda. I don't know much of the specifics of the new EPR rollout, but I do understand sort of the role of local government in the waste hierarchy, particularly when dealing with informal waste collectors and reclaimers. And the reality is that there's a lot of investor confidence. Like, investor confidence in local government in South Africa has been declining, like steadily over the last decade. And obviously, I feel like we've seen that local communities are becoming more reliant on the formal economy. So the informal economy within their locality is underdeveloped. And also, I don't really see the role of waste pickers and waste collectors on the ground level benefiting from this, because they're already subject to monopolistic markets where they're essentially exploited by your informal reclaimers that will sell that waste then into the formal market. So if you want local government to be more resilient, you need an active citizenship in the government. You need the community to participate. You need the community, to be able to understand what's going on in their local government and to keep local government accountable. At the same time, I feel like local government should also focus on, making these informal reclaimers, recyclers, pickers, and collectors more formal, more resilient, by essentially improving their by essentially improving their capacity to collect and process waste before it going into the formal waste management chain. So I feel like local government needs to work with the community first, and for the community itself to be able to enhance their informal waste collection. Because as you said, a lot of places, especially in South Africa, where you have informal settlements, don't actually have access to formal waste collection, and you have illegal dumping continuing. But these are resources. These are resources that can give people income immediately. And the way I see that going is, I think that co-ops, cooperatives, waste management cooperatives, are sort of a promising model. Obviously, they don't do that well in South Africa at all. If I'm not mistaken, at the national level, co-ops have a mortality rate of 8.12. Not only 8.12 of them survive. So it's really bad. And obviously the reason for that, it's quite complex. But I feel like if they had more support from local government, and if there was more protections for them, and if they had sort of capital coming in from investment, that they would be able to form more resilient structures. I feel like waste pickers and basically essentially the backbone of informal waste management are an untapped resource, and we're essentially not allowing them to develop themselves into something more resilient. So I think that we need to look at the development of more resilient co-ops, because if you look at countries like South America, if you look at Egypt, if you look at certain areas in India, where your waste pickers are co-opting and working together, they actually develop into small businesses, and the quality of life for those individuals participating in these co-ops improve, while delivering an essential service to their community. And the moment you have the community and local government more fortified against the influence of the formal market, it becomes easier to develop more equitable partnerships. So yeah, That's
Thanks,
fine.
Liam. I think you've raised a couple of really good points, and I want to hand over to Chad now, because I'm just thinking of his software background and thinking, is this where perhaps some of the solutions could lie in terms of connecting us more efficiently? Because I even think some of the waste pickers, they still have access to technology, or is there a way that we can bridge that gap with access to technology to get them to market sooner? Yeah, Chad, your reflections on the previous question and maybe a little add-on.
Well, I think the conversation is wild now.
It is. We'll try and bring it back.
Yeah, I think from your first question, Sally, technology, it's tricky. What we've experienced is, just not everyone has the ability to use technology. And that's one of the biggest barriers, from that. Obviously, what we've developed is a collectors app for our collectors. So it's very simple, they utilize it to capture data, but what isn't anything advanced, and we haven't gone through anything advanced for, the waste picker segment as yet, because access to data, access to mobile technology, these things are all bigger challenges. But I do think it's important, whether it is through technology or through manual processes, there needs to be a connection, better connection within the ecosystem. Because I've always said we always say how much waste we have. We always, say how little's getting recycled, and how much of that's being done by the informal waste collectors. So, but no one asks or discuss the how, because the how is they're going through bins, they're going to landfills to get this waste. Why aren't we focusing more on the how, which is simply connecting a resident to a waste collector, or to many waste collectors who can put out their recyclables. And so, that's why our focus is really on getting people to understand that by just simply separating the recyclables, you can make a life easier and more rewarding as well. So that's, from a simple standpoint, and, coming from a technology background, I do know that technology is never the answer. It's an enabler. So you need to have the processes going, you need to have the proper solutions, and technology can only enable that. And so, yeah, I guess that would be my answer to the tech question. But as well as in integration as a whole, yeah, the points highlighted by Professor Linda Godfrey and Liam was all obviously relevant. And I think localizing it is also important, because what works in Johannesburg is not necessarily going to work in Cape Town. There's obviously a bit more uniformity in Johannesburg and organization when it comes to the likes of Arrow, whereas in Cape Town there's not as much. We have small pockets of people working together, and so from a demographics point of view as well, we need to kind of decentralize it at this stage, because we can't give blanket solutions that works in one province and expect it to work in another province. And so again, yeah, I think like we all know, there's no solution for integration as yet. There's obviously guidelines, which is meant to come out in this year or implemented in this year. But again, where was this guidelines created? The research was done in a particular part of the country, and everybody needs to kind of, as Lima mentioned, it's very community driven, but at the same time, from a scale point of view, that impacts things. And so, yeah, I think that opens up a question of how flexible can people be when they come to integration. And again, at the end of the day, it needs to be through communicating with the guys who are being integrated, and those are the informal waste collectors. So yeah, that was a segue, I guess, but communication is key, and again, connectivity is also key to get this integration going.
You mentioned so many incredible points there, Chad, yeah, I mean, if you want to make this conversation even more wild, we can just try and, yeah, so there are so many good points that you guys are raising, because essentially, I think what's really important for me that seems to be coming through is this implementation of EPR. It could be part of the solution to reconnect people, right? And to get producers to be responsible for what they put out there and get that partnership going with municipalities. However, the implementation is where things might come undone unless we approach it from a decentralized type of way and have different ways of doing things, perhaps even within the same municipality. But people aren't necessarily always comfortable with that. I know in municipalities, there almost needs to be uniformity about the way we provide a service. So, you know, Chad, maybe let's just carry on with you. I mean, how do you see your business and the impact that, you know, new regulations are coming into play, all partnerships with the City of Cape Town, in your case, going forward? Will have, you know, for yourself and scalability and the two different types of business models that you're running. Sorry, all those questions. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, obviously on the EPR side, what has been interesting from our point of view is obviously, you know, things are still being organized, you know, from the PRO's point of view and how things are going to work. But also from, you know, the company's point of view, the manufacturers, we've had a few engagements, and it's quite interesting to see how many of them are trying to gauge who's collecting what, how much of each things that they're collecting. So they're kind of trying to build up their contact list of when things do happen. You know, they have suppliers who can provide them with these things. And so I think there's a big opportunity, obviously, from a collection perspective when it comes to EPR. I'm not quite sure of all the mechanics of it yet, but yeah, definitely for the informal waste collectors as well, they would need to be remunerated for their collection. So I think that's a great movement towards that sort of basic income for them, which we don't have obviously in South Africa. So potentially that could, you know, assist with obviously their income as well. And how that is going to happen, that's obviously a discussion, and we hope to, we're trying to be part of that, those conversations. So, you know, just trying to be in the right place at the right time. And then for from the city's point of view, we obviously know that the guidelines, sorry for the background noise, the guidelines are being integrated or implemented this year. And so from a municipality point of view, you know, from our perspective, we think that, you know, they'd have to start, you know, integrating waste pickers into that collection model, whether it be through tenders, or sorts of models like that. So future tenders potentially might, you know, require a specific amount of informal collectors that's collecting for the tender, or a certain percentage. So that creates a lot of opportunity for us, because, you know, for traditional tenders, it's difficult to compete with the big corporates. And so, yeah, we obviously focus on a certain niche, and, you know, moving forward, I think that'll create opportunities, depending on how things go moving forward. But again, when it comes to, you know, working with government, it's never as plain sailing. It's, yeah, you know, we have to kind of just see what happens, and the decisions that are being made, and try and put ourselves in the best position to assist, because we want to partner. It's not, we realize the only way to scale when it comes to waste management is to partner with the municipalities, and we've put ourselves out there since we started trying to partner. So we've been actively wanting to partner. The other side hasn't really come to the party. So, you know, we do want to partner too, because we are aware from a scalability point of view, that's the best way forward.
Thanks, Chad. I wanted to maybe let's try and bring it back before we go into the Q&A session. Just basically going back to the topic, which is the creating value for waste, incentives, a good or a bad idea. And essentially, I think let's try and bring it back. Although I think the EPR discussion is incredibly important, because it's going to have impacts on both businesses. But just maybe bringing it back to, and maybe Linda, if you could come in here, based on your experience, do we always have to create an incentive for waste collection, for waste management, for the right thing?
Yeah, thanks, Lillian. No, I don't think that we do. And you know, the national pricing strategy for waste management charges gives us a framework of all the possible incentives and disincentives, well, maybe not necessarily all, but for a large suite of incentives and disincentives that could actually be implemented in South Africa. But and as you said, you know, we're about to see EPR as one of those implemented in South Africa, but obviously acknowledging that that's only going to deal with maybe, what, 10 to 20% of the waste stream, if we're lucky. And there's a whole separate discussion to be had on how do we actually reduce the burden on local government to extend its services with the limited funding it has, given the whole issue around lack of payment for services. And that's a whole separate discussion that we could have. But I think this issue around, do we need to incentivize? For me, at the moment, there's an underlying issue that I think first needs to be addressed in South Africa, again, before we start to look at all of the advanced policy instruments that could be implemented, like pay as you throw or product taxes or things like that, is that, I don't think that we've gotten the pricing around waste management right yet in South Africa for various reasons. I think most municipalities in South Africa are not, despite government having prepared guidelines on how to do it, most municipalities are not working with full cost accounting, which means that they're underpricing for waste management. We certainly don't see strict enforcement on facility management at local government level as we do for the private sector. So there is this dual enforcement between public and private sector. And the problem with that is that a lot of municipalities can get away with operating uncontrolled dump sites. I mean, I'm still surprised when I travel around the country and I visit some of these sites. They literally are just dump sites, no gate control, no fencing, no compaction, no cover. And if you've got no capex costs and very little OPEX costs, you can operate a dump site incredibly cheaply, which again skews the entire pricing. And then I think the third issue is that we do still sit with inefficiencies in terms of operations, where again, partners like we've seen with Chad or Liam or other formal sector partners might be able to render a service more efficiently. And so all of those issues affect the pricing of waste collection and waste disposal, which relative to everything else, it makes them seem more expensive. So in South Africa, you can't even compost competitively with the price of waste disposal in some municipalities. So if I was a generator, why would I pay more as a business to send my organic waste, for example, to composting when I could send it to a dump site at near zero cost? So I believe the starting point has to be correcting that situation. We have to be forcing municipalities to work with full cost, but obviously they're under pressure to, again, reduce costs to citizens. We have to be strictly enforcing standards, and we need to be closing down our uncontrolled and controlled dump sites and shifting towards regional sanitary engineered landfills, with proper design, with proper gate control, weighing and things like that. And then once we have that in place, which again, if I speak about the technology trajectory that developed countries followed, once we have that in place, we can then start to talk about things like landfill tax, for example. But, there's no way South Africa could implement a landfill tax when you have dump sites that have no gate control and no weighbridge. I mean, on what basis are you going to determine the tax that's paid? So I think it's about, once again, it's about getting the fundamentals of waste management right. And once you have that in place, then adding on all of these additional things. I suppose just my last point, and it's one that personally I just struggle with as well, when it comes to the personal level, is do we incentivize behavior, which we think citizens should be doing anyway? And part of me always says, well, people should be doing the right thing. But again, we have to understand the South African context. We have to understand that there are levels of inequality and poverty, unlike elsewhere in the world. And we also have to understand that these are resources. Somebody bought that cool drink, they own the bottle as well. That PET has value. And why should they not be compensated for that value when they put that product back into the market or back into the economy? So yeah, I think that, I think it's probably a combination of those, but I think there are some fundamentals we have to get right first.
Absolutely agree. I mean, I think that should just be written into every single preamble before any legislation gets promulgated. Have you done the following first? But we probably can't do that. I just want to encourage those who are watching this webinar, please to send through questions. I'm sure you have many. We've got a couple that have come through. But before we go into answer that, I just want to give Liam the opportunity to, if he has anything to add to what Chad and Linda have both been saying about the incentives. Liam, anything to add on the incentive side?
Oh no, I quite agree with Linda. Like there are quite a few, things that we need to address really if we really want to solve this problem long term. And that's actually where I see incentives coming in. I see incentives more as a vehicle for, firstly addressing the socioeconomic disparity that, first and foremost makes this behavior, not viable, like not feasible, for the vast majority of South Africans. Like a lot of people don't have time to recycle. A lot of people can't afford to pay, like for, services, but if they're getting incentivized, to participate actively in the waste management, hierarchy, like then excellent, like that's perfect. But then also for waste pickers, essentially, like as I said, I think earlier, they are the most vulnerable, people in this chain. A lot of the time they are waste pickers because, their socioeconomic circumstances are far from the best. And this once again makes them very vulnerable to, more developed, collectors in their community. So you see it really often, the recycling center is actually profiting by underpaying waste pickers actually for the waste that they bring in. They don't actually understand the value of the waste that they collect and that they dispense. And incentives actually are an opportunity for these people to go and learn about the value that they can extract from waste through incentives, because they wouldn't be losing time learning about effective means of collecting waste and what the actual real world value is of it. We are essentially developing that baseline of waste management through incentivizing them to improve like their knowledgeability, and then also to organize themselves actually into small business structures. Because I know I spoke about co-ops the last time I spoke, but the reason I think it's really interesting in South Africa is because unlike cooperatives, for example, in South America or like in North American context, our co-ops are actually quite indistinguishable from small businesses in the way that they operate. So I also see it as a form of encouraging local economic development. And the moment you encourage the local economy of any given community, their participation in local government and their, the way that they hold their local government accountable will naturally improve. So yes, that's, I think, my final 2 cents. And once again, there's a lot of opportunity for us to develop our own models, and as Chad said earlier, like every single context, even within this country, is quite unique. You'll have, your more standardized Gauteng areas, then you'll have the Western Cape where everyone works in a bubble, but then you have a village in the Eastern Cape where you don't even have roads for, trucks to go in there. So recycling can't happen there, so we need to develop solutions that the community itself can benefit from. And when communities can see that benefit for themselves, they will, generally go on board. So, for example, if you think about your pilot, how many more people just started using the service because they actually got something out of it, and suddenly recycling, is something that they've adopted into their behavior. So it's, yeah, I think, I'm done now.
Thanks, Liam. I think like a statement you used earlier on, or term you used earlier on, was active citizenship. And I think that is definitely part of it, but it's a case of sometimes I think we feel so disempowered. It's like, how do we even do that? How do we even start? And I know like some people have been actively engaged in trying to bring certain landfill sites in various parts of the countries to book in terms of getting the operations right and to get the enforcement right. But it's taken huge amounts of manpower and huge amounts of money to try and get it to that kind of stage. I have got a couple of questions that have come through, so I'm just going to ask these now. And the first one is to Regeneres and to Tawanda. And it says, with the discussion focusing around local government providing opportunities for the informal sector and community-based organizations, how do you see the role of organizations such as yours, particularly with the need for having a paper trail and monitoring and evaluation in place? Chad, would you like to go first?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I think, from a discussion that we had with government previously and from, various engagements, is that, many officials aren't trained up or specialized in this specific field. If you're talking specifically about waste picker integration, and that's expected to now all of a sudden be able to do this. Whereas opportunities like this for our or companies like ours who's focused on it, who's currently doing it, it's a great way to rather partner with government as opposed to compete. So again, like I said earlier, it depends on what decisions are being made and how it will be made. But from our point of view, we've obviously built this because we found that there is a problem or a niche that needs to be focused on within the recycling space. And so, yeah, like I said, for partnerships, we're definitely open to it. We'd like to be a specialist with what we're doing and provide that service to local government instead of just doing it, for ourselves privately, and but through that, being able to scale into more places.
Thanks, Chad. Liam?
Okay, so our model is quite simple. So we essentially incentivize people to upskill themselves, and especially like in an informal economy settlement or setting, or in terms of if you're looking at local municipality, they really do want those local informal waste collectors to actually become more formalized, because it does make their job easier. And I think a big role of that is actually incentivizing people to get the necessary information, whether you or not you are participating directly in the waste management chain. You would still be a household. So for example, I feel like I'm talking myself into like a maze. Okay, basically where I would see the value of our incentives lying is incentivizing waste collectors that are already active in that community to expand their capacity and to expand the quality of their service, while at the same time upskilling the level of knowledge that their workers and the waste pickers that they work with in their community, to improve essentially their ability to grow their own income. At the same time, we've also used incentives in communities to host workshops where people can actually, learn how to actually process their waste, as I mentioned, like right at the beginning. And these incentives actually, are attractive because people come and they, learn new information, and then they participate, in the collection chain happening, where people are being incentivized to participate in waste collection, in waste picking, in recycling, in sorting. And then that business that's essentially hosting and distributing the vollers, grows in its capacity and grows in its ability to deliver the service. Now, the cool thing about our incentives is the fact that as they are earned, you actually capture data. So you can actually also, follow the amount of incentives going into a community to see, okay, this is how many households we've reached. This is how many waste pickers are active. This is the amount of revenue that is being generated as a consequence of all of these incentives going in. Because obviously, the small business owner, the recycling plant owner in that community isn't earning an incentive, but their workers are. And because they can now afford to, equitably pay their workers, they actually generate, more revenue because their capacity is increased. It also makes the process of picking waste and collecting waste more dignified. I know that's a massive, yeah. Oh no, I said I know that's quite a big obstacle that we're facing in the formalization of waste picking.
Yeah, and the term itself is maybe problematic, the formalization itself. But so both your systems have some sort of measurement tools in place where you can actually monitor the impact and measure and collect data, which is amazing. One of the next questions is fairly open. It's kind of a yes/no one. Does the City of Cape Town have a measuring system in place for waste? Yes, it does. Then another question, which I'm going to open up to the floor actually, because it's quite broad. How will alternative uses of waste affect the price of recycling the waste traditionally from a supply and demand perspective? I'm not entirely sure I understand the question completely correctly, but does anybody want to hazard a guess? I think I'm going to read the next question as well. Let me just check here, because we've got basically 6 minutes left, And I just want to give each of you a minute to wrap up at the end as well. I'm going to read the last question quickly. One of the main problems with the current system is the collection and treatment of low value waste, whereas mainstream recyclables are readily removed from the waste stream and cycled back. Low value still seems to pose an issue, even more so in informal settlements. With the current planning system still focusing strongly on the more valuable waste, looking at extended producer responsibility, waste picker integration, etc., what needs to be done in order to reduce and divert lower value waste?
Well, I mean,
Linda?
personally, I think the two questions are related. You know, why are we seeing collection of certain recyclables? Because the price is high. They're high because we've developed local markets for them. We've developed you know, high value local markets, and also the prices are high because there's a greater level of subsidization by the producers of those products. And if we're going to achieve the mandated targets for all of the different waste streams, whether it be e-waste, lighting, paper and packaging, tires, if we're going to achieve the mandated targets, we have to create a demand for the material. If there's no demand, it's not collected. So the question is, how do we create the demand? You know, we have to get the pricing right. Obviously, there is an issue, is that as soon as there's a demand for the material, people start to get a little bit greedy and then expect payment, and that starts to then affect the whole economics around it again as well. But, you know, if there are these market forces, essentially they do at some point, I think, stabilize. So yeah, I think those two questions are very closely related.
Absolutely. So we've got 4 minutes left. I'd like to not be the one keeping the floor. So I'd like to just give each of you a minute just to provide a summary of your thoughts on this webinar and what we were wanting to get out of it in terms of incentives and value creation for waste. Chad, can we start with you and then we'll work through the panel again? Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, sure. So I guess just in terms of incentives, you know, from our point of view, when you want to change behavior, it's either you punish or reward generally to get a behavior change. You know, and obviously from our side, we can't punish, we're not the government, and we went with the incentive side. From our experience, you know, obviously incentivizing the behavior isn't the first choice, but as Liam highlighted earlier, you know, there is a big population that still doesn't naturally perform these activities. And what we found is that, you know, the incentive more than anything is an attraction to want to do it. Sometimes just to get people to start with the behavior. It's not about, you know, incentivizing the behavior constantly. That there's a big population as well that just enjoys that attraction. So while they might not even use the incentives, the incentive is an attraction, which is important, obviously, to get people on board with that behavior change. And then secondly is that, you know, from our side, we started off incentivizing based on weight, and we changed that around last year or the year before to be based on activity, because we realized that we were, you know, supplementing the wrong behavior. We wanted to create a more circular behavior and being based on activities, not weight, because we realized, what are we teaching people by saying you're going to get more in Mali for recycling more? So that was a lesson for us, and I think that was one of the courses we attended with you, Sally, that kind of inspired that. So thanks for that. So yeah, that's our 2 cents. I think there is a place for incentive in a place like South Africa, where, you know, we need to get people on board and into this little bubble that we live in, where they even fathom the thought of recycling or circular economy or all these things. So like I said, from an attraction point of view, I think it's very important for us moving forward and achieving our targets.
Thank you, Chad. Linda, final comments?
I think just a very short one. You know, I think a lot of the discussion today has been about paper and packaging recyclables, because that's where the value is. But it's, you know, if we're really talking about this issue of extending service delivery to peri-urban, rural areas, unserviced areas, we have to be looking for complete solutions. Paper and packaging is a highly visible pollutant in those areas, but it's a small percentage of the waste stream. And so for me, it's just a case of we have to move towards complete solutions through working closely with communities and with citizens in those communities. Thanks, Elia.
Thanks. I think that's a great wrap up. Liam?
I'm going to try to keep it short, because Chad also mentioned quite a few of the benefits of incentives that I view. especially, if you have targeted, incentives for changing specific behaviors. And it's very difficult to get that right the first time. But, once you have a clear idea of actually the behavior that you want to drive and its consequential effects, on the community, then incentives become quite a powerful tool. And obviously, incentives are unfeasible if, you need to incentivize people forever, because that means you're not changing any behaviors, you're just paying people.
Quite right.
And that you need to have a clear outcome, for that incentive. And I feel like, as Chad said, like, it's quite a great environment for incentives, South Africa. And I also view incentives as a vehicle for, improving the resilience of, informal sector agents, like people that are actually, forming the backbone of, the waste management chain, as well as actually involving communities, in their solutions. So
thank you, Liam, for that as well. Absolutely great summation. And I unfortunately have to cut you off there. It's 11:15 and I've been given strict instructions. So thank you so much for the amazing debate this morning. And I'm sorry if I took us a little bit off track, but I mean, when you get you guys on a panel, I need to kind of delve a little bit, right? So thank you so much. I got a lot out of it. I hope everyone who watched it got a lot out of it as well. Thank you very much for your time this morning. Tawanda, over to you. Or not. Thanks, Tawanda.
Thank you very much, Sally, and thank you very much to our panelists. I think that was very, very insightful, and it touched on a lot of the real issues that we're trying to address. So with municipalities looking at community projects, so the idea around community engagement will be discussed in the next session, where an example of where things did not go quite well with the introduction of a project, as well as looking at people's behavior. Got a session on behavior that will touch on the illegal dumping that was mentioned in this course. And I do find it interesting. I found out recently that there's a 500 Rand fine minimum for dumping. So literally throwing down a piece of paper, you've got that. It is illegal and there is a fine attributed to it, but we need to see how we can implement some of the policies and legislations that are put in place. Thank you very much, and hope you join us for the next few sessions. And thank you very much to our panelists again.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, everybody. Bye.